people just don't understand. Like I know a couple weeks ago, and of course this is post 1 million as well, somebody writes me an email. I have an awesome feature for you. How quickly can you get this out? Like that was the title. How quickly can you get this out? And I'm like, okay, I'm just never going to do that. And then they're like, well, I'm confused and disappointed by your response. I thought about kind of responding to that, but at some point I'm like, sometimes you just got to let things go because they just have no idea what it takes to build a product. And sometimes people are super excited to tell you this specific thing that they need and they think they're doing you a favor. And when you don't go along with it, they're like, well, I'm disappointed that you're not listening to me. Welcome to ProfitLed Season 2, our Journey to a Million, Episode 15. My name is Melissa Kwan, co-founder and CEO of eWebinar, and your host. I'm here with my co-host, Todd Parmley, eWebinar's COO. Hey, Todd, how's it going today?
It's good. You know I went to acting school, right? Like 100 years ago. I haven't acted in at least 15 years, and I made my re-entry into acting yesterday for my friend's marketing campaign, which has won a Webby Award. It's doing really well. I played a psychiatrist.
What context was this?
It's hard to explain. It's Alexis Patar is the jewelry company, and go to their Instagram and watch the videos. It's basically a bunch of really horrible New York City women's archetypes that look amazing, but are horrible people.
Well, that Instagram actually blew up in the last year.
Oh yeah, it went bananas. I played Dr. Todd, Margot's psychiatrist. I'm called Dr. Todd because my last name is Lecter, and Dr. Lecter doesn't work very well. That's what I did with my day yesterday afternoon.
Well, I am in Lisbon today, where we are potentially assessing a second home. As most people know, we have a first home in Amsterdam, but anyone who's been to Amsterdam knows that they're not known for their cuisine or their weather, and both have gotten pretty boring and old. So we decided to come to Lisbon, spend a couple weeks, and see if we like it. And we are enjoying the cuisine because you can actually get food after 10 p.m. here, which you cannot do in Amsterdam. And we have a good crew of people here that can moved here in the last few years, very expat friendly, visa friendly. So we're taking this week to look at some real estate and see if we can potentially make it our kind of 2 months of the year.
I love Lisbon. I had the same experience when I went there. I felt like I could easily live there. People are very comfortable when you speak English. They don't take any offense.
But it's interesting because we've been looking at real estate. So Lisbon is a fairly old city, like very, very old kind of heritage apartments. And the number of large apartments you can find with extremely poor floor plans. Like you'll have a 2,000 square foot apartment, but it'll have like 10 rooms. And then every wall looks like it's load bearing. So it's been interesting so much that yesterday I Googled why are Portuguese architects so bad, and nobody really shared my sentiment. And it's not priced less because they have the square footage, but you'll find like extremely long hallways that wrap around the entire apartment and like very little usable space. So we're discovering this. So it's been an interesting journey. So in the last episode, we talked about the heartbreaking 10 go-to-market strategies that did not work for us and dove into each one while revisiting that was quite painful. And today we're going to talk about how we decide on our roadmap and our priorities, which is your specialty as a product manager. But mostly I want to talk about just starting in the beginning of like how we even came up with a wish list. Because I think a lot of people, especially like blogs, everything you read on the internet, consultants or whatnot that are, focused on product-led growth like us, are always talking about how you should be data-driven. And pre 1 million and even post 1 million, we had zero data.
I mean, there's a difference between quantitative and qualitative data. And I actually feel very strongly that in the early stages of a product, quantitative data, you don't even need to look at it. You just talk to your customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, like me in the beginning, feel like analysis paralysis, right? And my analysis paralysis came from like reading the number of things that I should do because I don't know what I'm doing. And then not doing anything because we don't have a platform or analytics installed. But at the end of the day, what matters most is your customers, like knowing that you're giving them the thing they need to run their business.
Also, like we were in a unique position because we weren't starting from scratch. We were ultimately inventing a better mousetrap. We spent time. And so for me, I'd actually done probably more, I don't even know if this is the right term, but it's the term I use, product migrations than like new products, which is basically saying, okay, you need to replace an old product with a new one. How do you reach a definition of feature parity that allows you to make the leap to the new product? But then why is it better? Like, why should people make the leap? And so in some ways that made it easier for us because I mean, I don't know if you want to share maybe even a little bit of your experience with existing products, but you had a very clear idea of what was missing.
Yeah, I mean, I used every single webinar automation solution I could find in my last startup to solve my own problem of doing live webinars. And coming into eWebinar, I had an idea of what I wanted the product to be, but also an idea of what's out there that we should or should not include. Kind of like rewinding into how we even came up with our first ever wish list, which, by the way, some of those items are still on our wish list. It just never made it, right? So in the beginning, we were like, okay, let's make this product and it should have these features. And I swear there was like 100. And then in the earlier episodes, we talked about how we had to eliminate those just to get our V1 out the door. So we were very meticulous about like, okay, this is a must-have, this is not a must-have, let's revisit it later. So our first wish list was from that, right? So we came up with all the things we thought we needed. And then as we got closer to launch, we're like, okay, let's kill off all these things and revisit it later. And that went into this somewhat graveyard of a wish list. And some of those things we reintroduced slowly over time. But in the beginning, it was like, okay, do we or do we not chase feature parity? And that, I think, is an extremely important question, because a lot of people feel like if our competitor has it, we also need it. Because if we don't have it, then we don't differentiate ourselves. I do not believe in chasing feature parity because that actually paralyzes you. Because if every product out there is the same, then there's no differentiation. So I think while it's important to have, I think, minimal feature parity is how you refer to it in the past, it's also important to be like, hey, my competitor has that. My product does not serve the same audience. So I'm not going to have that right now. And I'm going to build the 10 times feature that I believe I should have to win people over. Because if every product is the same, then there doesn't need to be another product. Then everyone's going to sign up for that one thing. I mean, I think everyone can kind of make their own judgment, but we made a very early decision to not be the same as everyone else so that we can carve out our own audience.
First of all, it was very refreshing to hear the way you spoke about it, that there was like, we're going to pursue a 10x feature. What makes us different? Because in a lot of projects in the past, we were really tied by management, and sometimes unnecessarily so, to hitting feature parity, in part because they were so afraid of their users, which is never a good place to be. It was really sort of a nice thing for me to be able to do, to step back as a product manager, go, okay, wait a minute. Of these features that we're trying to reach parity, what are really necessary? What are really necessary, period? But then what are also really necessary that might block someone from starting to use the product, realizing that they might have to make a trade-off, but that the new benefit that we were giving them with features that nobody had was going to be enough to get them to be like, okay, I'm going to make the switch. And so that was like really kind of fun and refreshing for me, honestly, because it was like being freed from the idea of feature parity is liberating.
One of the things that we also did that I think is fairly uncommon is we actively looked at who our customers were serving and who we did not want as our customers. So we actually looked at the features they had that attracted a certain audience that we did not want. We made a list of those and we said we were not going to have those things because we do not want to attract them. So for example, our competitors are automated webinar solutions that serve a very particular marketing audience who are a bit scammy, right? Internet cash marketers. You can buy my course for $2,000, but in the next 5 minutes, it's $20. And they had features that automated webinars in a way that made it feel like it's fake live. So like, for example, they have a fake chat feature where it has like fake conversations that make it feel like there's scarcity. We did not want to manufacture scarcity because we did not want to trick our customers, right? We didn't want to be the instigator of that. They had fake attendee counters that shows like, oh, it's 3 a.m. and you've got 1,000 people here. And then the fake counters go up and down. They have fake sales notifications that make it seem like people are buying when they're not. But it attracts a very particular audience that want to trick consumers, and we did not want to be known as that. So we had a list of things that they had that would attract that customer, and we said we would never have those features, while realizing that we were never going to get an audience that could be engaged from the beginning. And we were willing to lose that revenue to maintain a certain product integrity.
Yeah, but we still don't have those features. It was a good decision to like repel, period, a certain type of customer because they are lousy customers. customers. But also there was like a bigger opportunity there, which was everybody was trying to fake a live webinar. So the entire category was focusing on how can we make this seem live? When we were like, well, why not just make a great automated experience and not pretend it's pre-recorded? Like, everyone watches Netflix now. Like, nobody wants to wait to watch the show. Maybe they'll like join a live concert or like a live sporting event or something like that. But there was definitely a mismatch between the automated webinar category and the idea of on-demand video content, which sort of seems like, why aren't they thinking that way? But they never were. They wanted to fake people out.
There needs to be a certain level of conviction. And I recognize that the decisions that we made were a luxury because we had some funding to begin with. Like, I had just sold my company. David and I put in the first check. We did have the luxury of having more time in order to attract a certain audience that we wanted. And I do recognize that sometimes in business, you just need to get the customer. But it was so important for us to not be known as a scammy software company because I'd seen what people were saying about those companies online that I didn't want to be that. I do recognize sometimes if you need feature parity to get a certain customer to get revenue, you got to do what you got to do. But at what expense? Even today, every week we have people coming in to say, do you have a chat where I can upload a conversation? And they won't sign up because we don't have it, but we're okay losing them. And I think what ended up happening was we then had this massive wish list that did not make it into the V1 because we were just dragging out this launch for over a year and a half. And then we made a note of all the things our competitors had that we may or may not have. So now we've got a list of like 100 things in this wish list. But we also was in a position where we were using the product ourselves. I had sold a company previous to eWebinar. I was still working for them. And that company was the first customer of eWebinar. So we used eWebinar as the first training session for Spacio, which was my last company. And we used our own product extensively. And so we knew where all the shortcomings were, what we needed very quickly. Like within the first week, we already started coming up with new things that we needed as people were starting to use it because you literally do not know how the market and users are going to react to it. You can guess as much as possible, but you will not know how people will use it until you actually use it. And because we were such a small team, it was just myself, David, you who are part-time, some developers in Vietnam, that we did all our own support. So we knew from people using it, who were our customers, and managing support, what we needed to do right away, what were like fast follows. And that was the way that we came up with our wish list in the beginning, but still a large part of how we come up with it now.
From my point of view, that's the only way you should come up with a wish list at the beginning. It is, especially for a small startup, like be in support. Like you'll know immediately what you need to do next. Once we got past the launch, that was the main thing. It was like support and some stability issues, some scalability issues that people would tell us about that defined our roadmap for a year.
The great thing about doing it in support, especially because, we were in it full time, is when somebody says, I need this feature, but they're using it for a use case that you never envisioned. So when you're in support, you can be like, well, why do you need that? How did you come up with it? What other product has this feature? Because some people would come in and be like, oh, you have this feature, but it's not really built out in the way that I'm using it in this other product. So then we'll just dig into it as much as they'll share. And that was also how we added to our wish list. We logged everything as they came into Monday. Like we basically have this kind of spreadsheet-like wish list, which we still do in Monday. Nothing ever got lost. So then we log a feature, we put the chat conversation in there, and then we categorize it, whether it's a feature or a use case. And then over time, sometimes we revisit it. Mostly it goes into a graveyard. But the main point that we're trying to make is everyone talks about data, but everything we are sharing right now has no real science. It's just gut feeling. Talking to customers, we had no product analytics. In fact, we still don't. We're in the process of figuring out a platform. And the process is just what we felt good about and what we agreed on as a group.
We're a little behind the curve now in implementing analytics. We should have done it a little bit ago, but I just did a series of interviews. This is now, right? This is post 1 million. But I think even now, it's just important to point out that like my magic number is 6 interviews. I don't know why. I learned that somewhat from someone somewhere. I can't remember where, but it was like 6 or 7 interviews is the magic number. But basically you interview until you stop hearing anything significant that's new. That happened. It happens every time between 6 and 7 interviews. And then you know what you need to do. But, we are flying a little bit blind now. We're at a maturity now where we need to have better metrics.
Let's kind of talk a little bit about the process. So just so our listeners have an idea of how we actually figured out, like move things from a wish list into an action item. Imagine we've got this massive wish list. What do we do now? And on episode 12, when we were talking about staying lean, I talked about this a little bit, where every decision that we make is revenue driven. What is revenue driven, right? Does this feature increase signups? Does it increase retention? Does it lower churn? Is someone going to stay or sign up because we put this in? And we just guessed. How do you make decisions when there's 100 items on the list, right? It's like, is this going to help us make more money? So that's number one. And how often are people asking about it?
I think that you're a little bit exaggerating by saying guess, because you are getting information from customers. You don't know for sure. Like, the point is, it's not a science. It's the kind of thing where it's like, you are able to bring your business experience of X number of years, because you can feel it when a customer tells you, you're like, oh, that's going to affect their revenue, or that's going to make them look stupid in front of their customers, or that's going to prevent them from being able to do X. And when you think about it in terms of how it's going to impact their business, then you can really like be like, oh yeah, this matters. We have to do this, because they're going to leave or they're not going to sign up.
I mean, the revenue, I want to make a point where it's not just about your product, like your features. In the beginning, we did a lot of co-marketing partnerships with kind of peripheral products, companies with shared audiences, and anything we could integrate with that could get us into a newsletter. So that was also revenue that's not directly related to our product, but that would encourage a partner to promote us. So when we were integrating with Thinkific in the beginning, it's a course platform, but their customers use eWebinar to sell their course. So we did an integration with them where if you had a course on Thinkific, you could build it into eWebinar, and then you could surface like a purchase link. And that was kind of an excuse for them to promote us, and vice versa, because they don't have a solution like us. I went to their partnerships person and I said, give me the top 10 integrations that you guys have, because they integrate with marketing emails, CRMs. I was like, give me the top 10 integrations that you have ranked by popularity, and then we will go integrate with those, such that when we launch our integration, we already know that they're using ActiveCampaign, MailChimp, whatever, right? Zapier, whatever they're using. So that was actually how we got our first list of integration partners. And then we went to those guys and said, hey, we integrate with you. Is there a marketing campaign that we can do together? So it was kind of a sales/marketing decision, but also tied into revenue.
I just think companies, when they get to a certain size, lose the ability to make this kind of analysis. Everyone's so siloed, but that means that marketing and product are working together to be like, how can we reach a bigger audience, when product is only ever driven by either product metrics or customer feedback, where it's like, no, there are other legitimate business reasons to like make changes to a product that will affect your revenue that may not have a huge impact on your audience in the short term. So it's something that I think is a unique opportunity for small companies, that you are in support, that you can reach out to partnerships, that you can sort of think of it in a more holistic way, because that definitely gets lost when you're at a larger company.
Yeah. And I guess like we were running kind of two different roadmaps, right? One was like our features and the other was integration partners. Another reason why we were so heavily integrating with other people was because we wanted to be more tied in with obviously their solutions. But optically, when somebody comes in who to integrate with, it makes them feel like you're a more mature company than you actually are. We wanted to be associated with companies that were much larger than us because it made us look grown up.
People see a website, they don't know that you're only 3 people. They see a bunch of logos on there, and it's not a lie, but it's like, we integrate with all these people. Here are our customers.
Yeah. So basically like coming up with a massive wish list, listening to our customers, what gets asked for the most, figuring it out depending on revenue and integrations. But we also very quickly ran into stability issues and usability issues. And we're talking like the first 9 months. Very quickly when people signed up, there were, scalability issues where 200 people couldn't chat at the same time. And these are things you can guess, but you can only react a lot of times as those things come in. Or when 200 people want to join a webinar, the speed is really slow. So in the first year, I would say we were also just chasing stability issues because people would leave if they couldn't use it, because if their clients can't join, then we look like a small company and we affect their revenue and their brand. So for a long time, we couldn't do a lot of things also because, of course, our team is limited and you can only move as fast as time allows. But we couldn't work on cool things because we needed to just survive as a product. I mean, we tried different cadences, right? In the beginning, we would say, okay, every month we set different priorities, and that month let's do these things. But then we realized 4 weeks goes by super fast. So instead of every month, we ended up saying, okay, we're not really making progress every month. So let's change it to every quarter. Every quarter, let's focus on one big priority. So is it sign up? Is it chat? Is it stability? So that every quarter we would make a bigger leap versus having things every month and never actually accomplishing those things.
And what you're talking about is like not even necessarily cool stuff, but like new stuff, because it was like in one lane, we were focusing on stability and, usability, whatever it was. But then it was like we were losing doing anything new. And so having a singular priority of what we're going to work on in a quarter helped us focus so that even if that was a relatively thin stream of development, we were still accomplishing something of substance. That was sort of how we managed to innovate some while we were in survival mode.
And the other thing that we made sure we were doing is we weren't only listening to customers, right? Like while it's important to listen to customers, we want to make sure that we were also innovating outside of what they could imagine because we wanted to be different. We didn't want to have just feature parity, right? We wanted to delight them with things that they didn't even think about. I would say we were probably spending like 20% on integrations and then maybe like 60% on trying to chase what other people wanted. And then the other 20% were like, okay, what can we put out there that they've never seen before? What kind of visual experience within the webinar or cool features that we wish we could have that they didn't even know to ask for because they don't know what's possible. So I think that over time, then you spend less on feature parity and then more on creativity because at some point you exceed their expectations once you do have feature parity, I guess, or minimal feature parity.
I think that comes from two things. One of them is like reading between the lines of what your customers are saying, starting to be like, what is it they really want? What's standing in their way? Because like you said, they're only going to focus on what's in front of them. They're not going to think sort of expansively about your product. Only you're going to do that. It's not like you're not listening to customers at all, but you're not taking them at their word. You'll be like, what are they really getting at here? And also, what's just noise? What's just complaint? We should not be putting energy on that. But then the other thing is like having a vision for your product. Like when we did our webinar room redesign, we were solving a particular problem, which was we needed to improve our mobile experience. That was probably the biggest deficiency we had from our original product is the mobile experience. So we needed to fix that. But that at the same time, we wanted kind of a more elegant, sexy webinar room experience, right? That felt like, whoa, this is different. So that had nothing to do with what customers were saying. Nobody was asking for that. That's more of a design play than a feature play, but it still didn't really come from customers. It came from us.
I mean, the other thing that we were doing is even when we wanted to have feature parity with something else, we made sure that we went above and beyond to build it out. So I think a lot of software companies will have a feature and like achieve the minimal of what their customers want. And devil's in the details. So we are the company that is willing to go the extra mile, the extra 2%, which could take 50% of your energy. But because it's part of trying to be lean as well, is we don't want to go back and do it. Everything we do, we want to lower our own support. So everything that we put out there, it's going to be what someone else has and more. So we looked at how other people did their integration and we did it even better, more flexible, right? We went ahead to integrate with all the stuff that they don't have. If we have email features, for example, we would build it out 50% more than them. Because we also wanted, if somebody tried something else and came to us, they'd be like, oh, everything I ever wanted is there. In fact, multiple times we've had users come in and say, oh, every time I think, do they have this? It's just right there. And that is not by mistake. That's by design. We are willing to go the extra mile, spend more months on it to have something that's as perfect as we can imagine, rather than just having a thing that matches what someone else has, because it's just not good enough.
Yeah, because the alternative, which I think so many products do in focusing on, let's just put the least amount of this feature out there. And then if it's good enough, we'll lean into it. But it's like you end up just leaving a trail of half finished features. And so doing something right the first time, you don't want to just go all in on something that you don't have a reasonable assurity that it's going to be of value. Then you do it right once, because also we don't have time to loop back. This is obviously not before a million, but we just did a big schedule update. It's like, we're not going to look at that schedule again, probably for like 5 years. It's great. And that was after collecting feature requests from that for like a year and a half, 2 years. But the other thing that David is really good at is componentizing things. He's not thinking about just building the feature in the moment. He's like, how can this element that we're building be useful in the future? Or how can we design a backend that gives us the flexibility to do X later? So sometimes the extra effort never really showed up too much on the front end. People were like, this is great. But the extra effort then made it so that how many companies build these like Frankenstein products, and then they get to a point where they literally can't scale. Their backend is a disaster. And one of the things that I think in some ways we take for granted, because Dave is just so good at it, is that he's a great systems architect and he thinks about components and he thinks about scalability for the future. Some of that back at that extra effort isn't always immediate benefit for the customer.
You just made a good point where like our schedule feature, which is like super, super basic for a webinar product. And people have been asking for us to enhance that since day one. And we were not able to get back to it until 3 years later. And why is that, right? Because our product elsewhere outside of that has been so good and so feature rich that not having certain schedule features that other people have are not going to lose us customers. So that's another way of thinking about revenue and roadmap is like, okay, I don't have something that's as good as someone else, but is the rest of the product good enough to keep someone there so that they're willing to live with a little bit of shortcoming? And schedule was one of those things.
And in some of those cases, there were some reasonable workarounds that would actually require them to pay us more money. So sometimes people thought we were doing it on purpose. We're like, no, we're really not. It's like it didn't stand in anyone's way of using our product.
Listening to your customers does not mean I'm going to do everything that they say. Sometimes you have to be okay with just telling them, yeah, I don't have it. And they get angry or whatnot, or you know, they express their frustrations, but we're just not going to have it. And if that's so important to you that you need to cancel, then so be it, because I cannot change my entire roadmap because it's just so much bigger than this one thing for you.
Yeah. And in some cases, not only saying we don't have that, but we will never have that. Right. So it's like really clear, like that is not even of interest to us. I can't emphasize this enough, which is like being held hostage by your users. That is product hell, something to be avoided at all costs. And the way to avoid that is to learn to say no early on and not just listen to your customers, because you're going to chase every little feature. You're going to end up with the Frankenstein system. It's not good for anyone in the long term.
But no is never just no. Like if a customer comes in and you're like, no, I won't do this, you're not treating them like adults. You're not treating them like a partner. Like the way that we say, no, we can't do this, or we're not going to do this, and we give an explanation as to why that isn't going to happen. And sometimes that feature is too specific, or that feature attracts a certain audience that we just don't go after, or it's just too complicated, or you're the only one that's asked for this. Whatever the reason, I feel like a lot of times if you explain it, people are more forgiving than you think, because now you're involving them in the process and you're talking to them like an adult, like a partner, and they'll be like, oh, okay, like now I see. And then they kind of move on. And sometimes like people just don't understand. Like I know a couple weeks ago, and of course this is post 1 million as well, somebody writes me an email. I have an awesome feature for you. How quickly can you get this out? Like that was the title. How quickly can you get this out? And I'm like, okay, I'm just never going to do that. And then they're like, well, I'm confused and disappointed by your response. I thought about kind of responding to that, but at some point I'm like, sometimes you just got to let things go because they just have no idea what it takes to build a product. And sometimes people are super excited to tell you this specific thing that they need, and they think they're doing you a favor. And when you don't go along with it, they're like, well, I'm disappointed that you're not listening to me.
It is actually very hard. If you don't know the software development process and all of the moving parts that you're trying to juggle, it's very hard sometimes for people to understand why you're saying no. To them, it's like, but it's easy, just put a button here. And you're like, oh my God, you have no idea what that means. So there's that. right? But then some people are just jerks. They're like pouty babies. And like, who wants that customer? That's what I mean. Is like, if you cater to that crowd, you will end up in hell.
Yeah, we certainly have had negative reviews written online. And I say this always with love, where if another software is a better fit for you, it's totally okay if you cancel. You should go there. And people take offense to that. Write a bad review on G2 or whatever, but it is kind of what it is. So I want to talk more, which is totally in your domain, about the technicalities of how we move something from a wish list into planning, into development. Because I have had this question asked, but what I do know is in the beginning, David's goal was to use as little software as possible. So in our company, we don't have like a Jira or whatever people use. We only use Monday, like to-do lists, my podcast planning for product management. Our entire operations is on Monday. It was also my CRM for a while, because if you have as little things as possible, people will actually use it. And Monday is a very kind of spreadsheet-like visual process. And in my experience, spreadsheets is the easiest way to adopt something.
And I think probably from David's point of view, it has nice automation features. So like it will move things for you automatically. It does a lot of things that you would expect a traditional kind of like dev ticketing system like Jira to do.
It's got like an IFTTT-like thing built in. So you could say like, when this task comes, email Melissa. Or like, when the status changes to this, move it to another board. So all of that is already built in. But can you talk a little bit about, okay, what happens when things go into a wish list within Monday? Like, how do we categorize how things get moved?
Instead of having a big, long backlog, I do have another level, which is deep freeze. So I can put things out of sight, out of mind. Even though ultimately I'm just moving it to a different place and putting it in the closet, it helps me focus only on the things that I know are possible in the somewhat immediate future. Basically, I'm like, I really only want to see things that either keep popping up or that we have a particular business interest in. So I have some vision of the possibilities of things that we might work on. But, being so small, we never know what's going to come up that we need to work on next. I think somewhat that's evening out now, but for so long it was like we had some idea and we'd be working towards designing and speccing it out, and then we'd switch directions. And that, I think, is just the reality of a small startup, and that's just fine. Which, by the way, is a reason to not plan too far ahead. Some people at a big company would be like, you need to have X number of months of groomed backlog. I'm like, no way. I just have a list of the things that I think we're probably going to work on next. And I am only really speccing them out right before they go into development. I do think we had some growing pains for this because I was used to teams that would meet in a traditional cadence of meetings with backlog grooming and sprint planning and all of that. And it just didn't make sense for us to do that. And David had come from more of a background where large companies like Microsoft, which you spec the hell out of everything before you go into development because you got to get it right the first time. We had to figure out a way to like work together that worked for both of us, which I think we've done really well. We also don't have designers. It's me. We have a designer that we go to for important things, but for day-to-day features, this is like going to horrify some people. I'm the only product manager you will ever meet who does mock-ups in Google Sheets. The problem with that is that you don't have like a working prototype. You don't have anything. So in the back end, what would happen is the thing that would come out on the other end would be mostly right, but we spent more time iterating on user acceptance testing, which I mean by a feature would be completed per its original requirements and put into our dev environment. And then I would go in and go through the original requirements, requirement by requirement, to make sure it was correct. And sometimes it was just like, oh, that didn't work. That design is terrible in reality and had to be tweaked. Whatever it was, it's like when you're moving that quickly without like a process of meetings and grooming to kind of like make sure that you have a lower probability of having to redo some things, you're going to have to redo some things on the other end. But I think we got pretty good at getting to the point where most of that stuff was just superficial. We would make sure that we understood kind of like the mechanics of the feature up front so that it was built properly from the back end so that if we needed to do some kind of like tweaking at the end, we could. So the way it would work in reality is like it would go into dev and then I would go through the requirements and do like this mini iterative cycle. It's usually just one engineer I'm working with. We're like also talking on Slack about the feature until we get to a definition of done, which we decide in that mini iterative cycle, which, traditionally you would want to do in your sprint planning, in your backlog grooming.
Todd and I figure out on the things we want to do this quarter. I don't really get involved after that. I'm like, okay, this quarter we're working on chat. That's it. And then we go through this backlog list and we pick out, and at that point, a lot of these features that we logged over time has already been tagged chat. So then we filter that. And then we go through feature by feature. Do we keep this or not? And how is it going to work? Are we going to do all this or not? And then you will go to have a conversation with David separately to be like, what's possible? And then you will spec that out. And then you create a spec. And then from backlog, you move it into another list. And then it goes into development. But there's many conversations that happen before items physically get moved from backlog to discussion to spec and then development.
Yeah, we have a planning session and we pretty honestly loosely define it. There's only one step you missed, which is I do kind of a rough idea of how I think we should solve the feature, because otherwise, if I go to David with nothing, I at least need to define the problem for him and say, here is a possible solution within the context of the UI of our current product. But I don't nail it down. I just put together enough so that we can have an intelligent conversation about what we should or shouldn't be doing. And so much of that is like when you work with engineers for a long time, you do start to understand from them some idea of level of effort of things, but you really have no clue until you talk to the engineer. And then they're like, oh, that's like a 20-month project. And you're like, oh, well, let's not do that now. It's basically a negotiation. And there should be a push-pull between product and engineering, where engineering is saying, here's what's feasible, here's what's the best approach. And then product is saying, is trying to basically be the voice of the customer. So we would negotiate what we thought was a solution. It wouldn't be fully defined. So then I would go back and I would start speccing out the actual features, and you would run into all sorts of things. You'd be like, oh, we didn't think of that. We didn't think of that. What about this? And so then I would sometimes propose a solution, sometimes not. I would just make a note. And sometimes we would have to meet again. But oftentimes the second time when I would deliver sort of like a spec to David, which is very different than writing a bunch of user stories, by the way, for product managers out there. It's like basically you're delivering a spec. Sometimes we would finish grooming that spec through Slack. We didn't need to meet again. Sometimes we would have to meet again. We would just jump on a huddle in Slack and be like, well, how about this? How about this? How about this? Typically, the main original meeting where we were negotiating how the feature would kind of function within the larger ecosystem of the product was enough so that we could work asynchronously after that through Slack to kind of finalize it. And then you still miss stuff, especially when you're only two people looking at it. So then you have what I was talking about earlier, that tight iteration cycle at the end with the engineer to get it to quote unquote done. And then it's ready for launch.
But after coding, what happens? Like, what is our QA process? Like, I don't even know.
I mean, honestly, I can only guess at some of this, but I have a very strong sense that David has instilled in the engineers that they are responsible for the feature, period. I think one of the problems that happens in larger companies is engineers throw something over the wall to QA, and then QA has to figure out if it's right. It's so much better when an engineer takes ownership of being a deliverable feature so that ultimately they are doing the QA. And then I wouldn't call what I do as QA, I call it UAT, user acceptance testing, which is basically like I'm sitting in the role of product manager to make sure that it's accomplishing what we want to accomplish. But then I'm also sitting in the role of customer where I'm like, that's confusing. Something will come out and be like, if I saw that for the first time, I would have no idea what the hell it was. So we have to adjust. Oftentimes it's language changes. Oftentimes it's like, oh, this actually needs to be moved up into this group. We didn't think about that before. You will have this iterative cycle on the other end, but if you do the kind of proper negotiation with your engineer and product at the beginning, then you don't have much to clean up on the other end.
I mean, I know that we do things fairly different than a large company. We try to cut down on how many steps there are, processes, calls. Everyone's remote, so nobody really wants to get on a call at different times. What are some good or maybe unique things that you can share with our audience that we do that you think is maybe uncommon with other companies? Can you think of anything?
I think some of what I just shared really falls into that category. Engineers who take full responsibility for the deliverability of a feature. You cannot separate engineers from QA. They really need to take ownership of their own work. I mean, I guess there's a lot of people who do that, but at least in my past experience, that was not the case. Maybe it's more common than I think, but for me, it was oh my God, thank God. I think speccing things out, because it is a little bit more of a mini waterfall approach, which is basically you worship the devil if you take that approach in the product world. And it's the reality of what we have to do. But the reason it works, which was hard fought, it took a bit for David and I to figure out how to make this more efficient, was we needed to find a way to make sure we were 100% on the same page at the beginning of the process with the mechanics of the feature. And that requires very close communication between engineering and product, which is two people here. So it just means we have to find a way to communicate. And I think it's actually important to say that collaboration doesn't mean agreement. You have to learn to respectfully disagree with people and come to something that works. If it ever crosses the line in disrespect, you got to clean that up. Whoever's issue it is has to clean that up as quickly as possible and take accountability. But I think everything that's kind of unique or great about the way we work has everything to do with our size.
I've been in companies that are where they're just inflexible. And I think as a startup, especially bootstrap startup that cares so much about revenue and keeping customers and retaining them and make sure they don't churn, is I think what we do really well is we're super flexible. So it's yeah, we do priorities by quarter, but we're not the quarter ends today. Or we're let's do this feature, but if this doesn't work and it's going to take too much time, let's just kill it. Let's just not do it. I've been in companies where they're oh no, this is just what we're working on. That's it. You have to wait till next time. It's what? We're a 30-person company. Why are the processes so set in stone? And you have to be agile and flexible and be open to ideas, because then everyone has a better time. It doesn't make sense because businesses don't fit in a box.
No, and I think medium-sized companies like that, you can maybe do that and still make it work, but it's death to a company of our size. Lack of flexibility at our size is just you're basically asking to die.
So I think it's a good place to wrap up. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. What did we talk about today? We talked about how we come up with our wish list, how we decide what to put on our roadmap, and then we talked about the actual execution process of how we turn a wish list into an actual feature. With that in mind, what is your hot take for today?
I mean, I think when it comes to priorities and a wish list, especially in the early days, let's say pre-1 million ARR, there really is no magic bullet when you have no data. Don't listen to what everyone says that you can't make decisions without data. You can make very, very good decisions by listening to your customers, listening to your gut, hearing what they ask for repeatedly, because you as the founder, you as a founding team know what they're going to buy and you know what's going to sell. And sometimes you just got to do whatever it takes to get to revenue fastest. So listen to your gut, look at your bank account, and make decisions accordingly. Screw the data. You will get to the data later when you have more customers.
My sort of hot take is in some ways just a little bit different point of view of what you just said, which is the only data you need is what your customers say. That is data. It's qualitative, but you're so close to your product. You're so close to the problem. You're so close to watching your bank account and it's going down. You're feeling that if you're not profitable yet. And so I also say, trust your gut, and you can build a great product for people by just listening to them and be scrappy.
I mean, I think what most people don't understand about data is that it's not just installing a platform, it's a full project. So if we're determining priorities by the quarter, that's a quarter that you're not doing something else. And if you don't have enough customers and users to give you that data, the time you spend on that isn't that worthwhile. And you need to know how people are using your product first to know what to measure.
Exactly. You don't even know what to measure yet. I'm actually very much a fan of only relying on customers and your own idea of the business, period, at first.
Well, if you've been enjoying this podcast, we have a small favor to ask. The only way this podcast grows is by word of mouth. So if you'll do us a little favor, hit the subscribe button or follow button wherever you're listening or watching this right now. It would mean the world to us and help us continue to spend time making these episodes for you. You can ping me on LinkedIn if there are particular topics you want us to get into this season. Send me any feedback you want on this podcast because I love hearing from you. Again, my name is Melissa Kwan, last name spelled Kwan. And to get notified of new episodes, join our mailing list by going to ProfitLed.fm. I promise to only share things you'll actually care about. Thanks for listening. Bye now.
Bye.